Riverbend was the kind of town where nothing extraordinary ever happened. Tucked away between forested hills and a lazy river, it was a peaceful, almost forgotten place. The townspeople lived simple, predictable lives, and any news that spread was rarely more exciting than a local fair or the announcement of a new baby in the community. For Jake Miller, Riverbend was a sanctuary, a place where he had rebuilt his life after fleeing the chaos of his past. He had lived here for over 15 years, long enough to be seen as one of their own, despite his quiet and somewhat reserved nature. Jake wasn't a man who stood out. He was in his late 40s, with graying hair and a weathered face that told the story of hard work rather than hard living. Every day, like clockwork, he would open the garage where he worked as a mechanic. His hands were always covered in grease, and he spoke little except for polite small talk with his customers. But for those who knew him well, there was an air of mystery surrounding Jake. He never talked about his life before Riverbend, and no one had ever pressed him for details. Everyone had secrets, and in Riverbend, as long as you kept to yourself and didn't cause trouble, people respected your privacy. Jake's days were as ordinary as could be. He lived in a small house just on the outskirts of town, an unremarkable place that suited him perfectly. The townspeople would often see him riding his old pickup truck, running errands, or heading to the town's community center, where he volunteered to fix broken appliances or help organize events. To many, Jake was a fixture of the town, reliable, hardworking, but invisible. No one suspected that the quiet mechanic harbored the kind of secrets that could shake Riverbend to its core. On an early autumn morning, as the first hint of frost kissed the ground, Jake started his day like any other. The garage was quiet, the air crisp with the smell of oil and gasoline, and the occasional hum of an engine. Business was slow, as it often was this time of year, so Jake spent his morning tinkering with a customer's old motorcycle. The peace of his day was interrupted only when the mailman arrived, handing Jake a small stack of envelopes. Jake tossed the usual bills and advertisements aside, but one letter caught his eye. It was different from the others. No return address, the envelope made of heavy, cream-colored paper. His name was written in bold, elegant handwriting, a handwriting that immediately sent a chill down his spine. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he tore it open. Inside was a single folded piece of paper and a business card from a law office in the neighboring city of Glendale. The letter was formal, and the words, though brief, sent Jake's world into a tailspin. Dear Mr. Miller, it is our duty to inform you that you are the beneficiary of the estate of Mr. Gregory Harper. As the executor of his will, I must insist you come to our office at your earliest convenience to discuss the terms of the inheritance and other legal matters. Kind regards, Alexander Collins, Esquire. The letter might have seemed like routine legal communication to anyone else, but for Jake, it was as if a ghost had risen from the dead. Gregory Harper. The name was one Jake had tried to forget for nearly 2 decades, a name that carried with it the weight of everything he had left behind. Greg had been his best friend, his business partner, and eventually his worst enemy. They had run a small automotive business together back in the city, but Greg had ambitions far greater than fixing cars. He had pulled Jake into dealings that blurred the line between legitimate business and criminal enterprise. Jake had walked away, or rather, he had run, leaving Greg, their business, and that life behind, hoping never to look back. But Greg had disappeared shortly after Jake left, and his whereabouts had been a mystery ever since. The last time Jake had heard his name was in the police station, when they questioned him about Greg's sudden disappearance. The detectives had made it clear they suspected foul play, and Jake was not above suspicion. But lacking any evidence, the investigation had gone cold, and Jake had moved to Riverbend to start anew. Now, after all these years, Greg Harper's name had re-entered his life in the form of this letter, and he was apparently dead. Jake folded the letter and stared at it for a long moment. Why had Greg left him anything? They hadn't spoken in years. Surely there were others closer to Greg who would have been more deserving of any inheritance. But as Jake mulled over the letter, the thought occurred to him. Greg had never been the kind of person to leave anything to chance. If he had left Jake something, it wasn't out of kindness. There had to be more to it. That evening, Jake sat on the porch of his house, watching the sun set behind the hills, his mind racing. Riverbend had become his sanctuary, a place where the shadows of his past couldn't reach him, or so he had thought. Now, it seemed those shadows had followed him after all, and Jake wasn't sure if he was ready to face them again. The next few days passed in a blur as Jake went about his normal routine, but the letter never left his thoughts. It sat on the kitchen table, staring at him like an accusation. He told no one about the letter, not even the few close friends he had made in Riverbend. One of them was Tom Jenkins, the owner of the diner where Jake often had his meals. Tom had known Jake since he moved to the town and was one of the few people Jake trusted. But even with Tom, Jake didn't feel comfortable sharing his past. As the days dragged on, Jake knew he had to make a decision. He could ignore the letter, pretend it had never arrived, and continue living his quiet life, or he could face whatever Greg had left behind for him, even if it meant reopening old wounds. The idea of visiting the law office in Glendale filled him with dread, but a part of him needed to know. What could Greg possibly want from him after all this time? Finally, on a crisp Saturday morning, Jake made up his mind. He packed a small bag, filled up his pickup truck, and set out on the road toward Glendale. The drive was long and winding, the landscape gradually shifting from the peaceful hills of Riverbend to the bustling outskirts of the city he had once called home. As he approached Glendale, memories of his old life flooded back, his work at the garage, his friendship with Greg, and the slow descent into the kind of life he had sworn to leave behind. Arriving at the law office, Jake sat in his truck for a long time, staring at the nondescript building. His heart pounded in his chest as he replayed the past in his mind. Could this visit bring closure, or would it drag him deeper into the mess he had escaped all those years ago? With a deep breath, he stepped out of the truck and walked toward the office door. This was the first step into the unknown. Little did Jake know, this single decision would be the start of a chain of events that would upend not only his life, but the entire town of Riverbend. Everything he thought he had buried in the past was about to resurface, and nothing would ever be the same again. Jake stood in the small, sparsely furnished waiting room of Collins & Associates, the law firm where the mysterious letter had directed him. The air was sterile, heavy with the scent of old wood and leather, and the ticking of a clock on the wall did little to calm his nerves. His mind buzzed with questions as he stared at a photograph of the late Gregory Harper hanging on the wall opposite him. The image sent a rush of memories flooding back, memories he had worked tirelessly to suppress. Why now? Why after all these years? The receptionist, a stern woman in her 50s, ushered him into the office of Alexander Collins, the lawyer responsible for executing Greg's will. Collins was younger than Jake expected, probably in his late 30s, with sharp eyes that gleamed with a mixture of curiosity and professionalism. He motioned for Jake to sit across from him at a massive oak desk, cluttered with papers and a single manila folder bearing Greg's name. "Mr. Miller," Collins began, his voice polite but businesslike, "I'm glad you could make it. I'll get right to the point. This concerns the estate of Gregory Harper, who, as I'm sure you're aware, passed away recently." Jake nodded stiffly. He hadn't been aware of Greg's death until the letter arrived, but he wasn't about to show his ignorance. The mixture of emotions stirred within him: anger, sadness, and most of all, confusion. Why had Greg left anything for him? Their relationship had ended on bitter terms, with accusations and mistrust hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Collins opened the folder and pushed a set of papers toward Jake. "Before we proceed, I need to inform you that Mr. Harper's estate is complicated. His death, while officially ruled an accident, has raised some questions, especially considering his disappearance 20 years ago." Jake's heart skipped a beat. Disappearance. Everyone had assumed Greg had skipped town after their fallout, but this was the first time anyone had used the word disappearance around him in an official capacity. He swallowed hard, a sinking feeling settling in his gut. Collins continued, flipping through the documents. Mr. Harper was presumed dead shortly after he vanished. However, it seems he lived under the radar for quite some time. His body was only discovered 6 months ago in an abandoned warehouse in the city. Cause of death: carbon monoxide poisoning. Accidental, or at least that's what the coroner said. Jake couldn't hide his shock. 6 months ago, and no one knew. Collins shook his head. No, and that's where things get even stranger. You were named the sole beneficiary of his estate, Mr. Miller. That includes a substantial property just outside Riverbend. I've reviewed the legal documentation, and it's airtight. Jake's mind raced. A property outside of Riverbend. Greg had been living so close, and he hadn't known. The very idea felt like a cruel joke. He had come to Riverbend to escape his past, and now it seemed that past had been lurking just a few miles away, waiting for the right moment to reemerge. What's the catch? Jake asked bluntly, leaning forward. He wasn't stupid. Greg had never done anything without an ulterior motive. If he had left Jake a property, it wasn't out of the goodness of his heart. Collins hesitated, his expression carefully neutral. I can't say for certain, but from what I've gathered, this property may hold certain items of interest to Mr. Harper's former associates. There's no official mention of it in the will, but I think you can guess what kind of items we're talking about. Jake's blood ran cold. Greg's former associates was a polite way of saying criminals, people who had pulled Greg into their world of under-the-table deals and illicit activities. Jake had distanced himself from that life just in time, but Greg hadn't. If this property was linked to that world, it could mean trouble for anyone who came near it. Collins pushed a set of keys across the desk toward Jake. You're under no obligation to take ownership, but the property legally belongs to you now. I'd advise you to visit it and assess the situation. Be careful, though. It's been abandoned for years, and I can't guarantee it's in good condition. Jake stared at the keys, a wave of dread washing over him. Every instinct told him to walk away, to leave this tangled mess behind, and return to his quiet life in Riverbend. But something stronger, perhaps curiosity, perhaps guilt, held him in place. He needed to know what Greg had left behind and why. There was no avoiding it now. A week later, Jake found himself standing at the entrance of the property, just outside the town limits of Riverbend. The house was nothing more than a shadow of its former self, an old 2-story Victorian-style building that looked like it hadn't seen a living soul in years. The once grand structure was now covered in ivy, its windows cracked, and its front porch sagging as though the very earth beneath it had begun to give way. Jake's hand gripped the keys tightly as he approached the front door, each step echoing ominously in the quiet, overgrown yard. There was no sound but the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional creak of the house settling into itself. As he slid the key into the lock, the door groaned open, revealing a dark and musty interior. Dust filled the air, illuminated by thin rays of sunlight filtering through the dirty windows. The furniture inside was draped in white sheets, giving the entire place the eerie feeling of being frozen in time. Jake took a cautious step inside, his boots creaking against the wooden floorboards. The air was thick with neglect, but something else lingered, something darker, more sinister. The silence pressed in on him, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to uncover whatever secrets it held. He wandered through the rooms, taking it all in. The living room was lined with bookshelves, filled with old volumes that looked untouched for years. A grand piano sat in the corner, its keys yellowed with age. The dining room, with its long table and faded floral wallpaper, hinted at a time when this house had hosted dinners and gatherings, though those days were long gone. But it was the study upstairs that caught Jake's attention. Tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway, The door to the study was locked, unlike the others. His heart raced as he fumbled with the keys, finally finding the one that fit. As the door creaked open, Jake's breath caught in his throat. The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the house. Clean, organized, and disturbingly recent. Papers were stacked neatly on the desk, and an old leather-bound journal lay open, as if someone had been reading it just moments before. Jake hesitated before stepping inside, a sense of unease crawling over him. He picked up the journal, flipping through its pages, recognizing Greg's handwriting immediately. The entries were scattered and disjointed, filled with half-finished thoughts and cryptic references to people Jake had never heard of. But one entry near the end stood out, written just days before Greg's death. "Jake, if you're reading this, then I'm already gone. You were right to walk away all those years ago, but I wasn't. I got in too deep, and now there's no getting out. They're coming for me, just like they always do. I'm sorry for dragging you into this, but you're the only one I can trust. If you're here, you've inherited everything, including my mistakes. Be careful. Trust no one. And whatever you do, don't let them find you." Jake's hands shook as he lowered the journal. The cryptic message confirmed his worst fears. Greg hadn't just left behind a house. He had left behind a dangerous legacy, a legacy that could bring trouble to anyone associated with it. Just then, a sound broke the silence, a soft thud from downstairs. Jake's pulse quickened as he turned toward the hallway. Someone else was in the house. He wasn't alone. The next few moments passed in a blur of adrenaline. Jake moved quickly but quietly, his footsteps barely audible on the creaky floorboards. He pressed himself against the wall, listening intently for the source of the noise. Whoever it was, they were downstairs, moving slowly, cautiously. Jake's mind raced. Had someone been following him? Were they after whatever Greg had left behind? His thoughts spiraled, and a chill ran down his spine as he considered the possibility that Greg's warning had come too late. A second thud sounded from the living room, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched near the top of the stairs, peering down into the dimly lit hallway below. The figure was moving deliberately, searching the rooms with a quiet intensity that suggested they weren't there by accident. Jake's breath hitched as the figure stepped into the light for a brief moment. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in dark clothing. Jake didn't recognize him, but he knew one thing for certain. This man wasn't here for friendly conversation. The man paused near the front door, scanning the room with sharp, calculating eyes. Jake's grip tightened around the journal as he silently backed away from the stairs. He needed to get out now, but as he turned toward the back of the house, a third noise stopped. Jake froze in place, his breath caught in his throat. The third sound was unmistakable, a deliberate click, like a door being slowly opened or a lock being tampered with. He cursed under his breath, heart racing as he realized the front door wasn't the only entry point to the house. Someone else was outside, and they were trying to get in. The house, once an abandoned relic of a life left behind, now felt like a trap closing in around him. His mind whirled with possibilities. Who were these people? Were they tied to Greg's shitty past, or were they part of something even larger, more sinister? Whatever the case, Jake knew one thing for sure. He needed to get out before they found him. He quickly glanced around the room, weighing his options. The back door of the house was a possibility, but it was too close to where he'd heard the most recent sound. He'd have to make a run for it, and there was no guarantee he wouldn't be spotted. The other option was hiding and waiting for the intruders to leave, but something in his gut told him they wouldn't leave empty-handed. They were looking for something, maybe even him. Suddenly, the man downstairs spoke, his voice low and authoritative. "You find anything yet?" he called out, addressing someone else, likely the person trying to get in through the back. "No," came the response from the other side of the house. The voice was rough, impatient. "This place is a dump. Nothing but dust and old books. He better be right about this." Jake's pulse quickened. They're looking for something specific, he thought. His mind flashed back to Greg's journal, the cryptic warning scrawled in its final pages. Trust no one. Don't let them find you. Clutching the journal tightly, Jake crouched low and moved silently across the study toward the large, heavy wardrobe in the corner of the room. It was the only real cupboard he had, and if they came upstairs, he'd need a place to hide. As he eased open the wardrobe door, the ancient wood creaked, and he winced at the sound. He quickly slid inside, leaving the door slightly ajar so he could see out. The space was cramped and smelled of old clothes and musty wood, but it would have to do. From his hiding spot, Jake strained to hear what was happening downstairs. The man who had spoken first was now moving from room to room, his footsteps heavy and deliberate as he searched. He was methodical, taking his time. The other man had managed to enter through the back of the house, and the two of them were now moving toward the staircase. "You sure this is the place?" the second man asked, his voice gruff and full of doubt. "Looks like no one's been here in years." The first man, whom Jake had mentally dubbed leader, responded with a cold edge to his voice. "This is the place. Harper kept it under wraps for a reason. There's something here, and I intend to find it." Jake's chest tightened at the mention of Greg's name. They're after Greg's secret, he realized. But what is it? The men's footsteps grew louder as they reached the bottom of the stairs. Jake held his breath, every muscle tense as he heard them ascending. Each creak of the old wooden steps brought them closer, their presence looming larger with every moment. His mind raced with escape plans, but none seemed viable. There was nowhere else to go. The men reached the top of the stairs. Jake could see their shadows flickering against the walls as they moved into the hallway. One of them, the leader, paused just outside the study door. "Check this one," he said to his partner. "Harper would have kept something important hidden, maybe in the back. Look for safes, hidden compartments, anything that doesn't belong." The second man grunted in response and shoved the door open with a force that made Jake flinch. The room filled with the harsh light from the hallway, and the intruders began their search. Jake could see them through the small gap in the wardrobe door. The second man, a burly figure with tattoos creeping up his neck, started rifling through the papers on Greg's desk, tossing them aside like they were worthless. He moved to the bookshelf next, pulling out books and flipping through them carelessly. The leader, on the other hand, was more deliberate. He moved toward the far wall, running his hands along the wood paneling, looking for something, perhaps a hidden safe or compartment, just as he'd mentioned. Jake's mind raced. If they found whatever it was they were searching for, would they leave, or would they continue searching until they found him too? The second man kicked the desk in frustration. Nothing. Just a bunch of old papers and junk. The leader didn't respond. He was focused on the wall, tapping lightly as if listening for hollow spots. After a moment, he cursed under his breath. "Harper was smarter than I thought," he muttered. "There's gotta be more here. Keep looking." As the men searched, Jake's thoughts returned to Greg's journal. It wasn't just a diary. It was a key. Greg had left clues, hints about what was hidden here. And if these men were so determined to find it, it had to be something valuable. But Jake couldn't risk pulling it out now. He'd have to wait for his chance. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from downstairs. The sound was followed by silence, and then a third voice. Different from the other two, younger and more urgent. "You idiots! What the hell are you doing?" Jake froze. A third person. He hadn't seen or heard anyone else outside the house. The leader and the second man exchanged a quick glance before the leader barked back. "Who the hell are you?" Footsteps pounded up the stairs, and moments later, a young man appeared in the doorway. He was in his late 20s, with disheveled hair and a nervous energy that contrasted sharply with the cold professionalism of the two intruders. His eyes darted around the room, landing briefly on the wardrobe where Jake was hidden before turning back to the leader. "Where's the money?" the young man demanded, his voice shaking slightly. The leader frowned. Money. You think we're here for money. Isn't that why we're all here? The younger man shot back, his voice rising in desperation. Greg Harper had a stash hidden somewhere in this house. I was supposed to meet him here. He promised me. The leader cut him off with a cold laugh. You're an idiot. Harper wasn't hiding money. He was hiding something a lot more dangerous. And if you had any brains, you'd turn around and walk away before you get yourself killed. The younger man blinked in confusion, clearly not expecting this response. Dangerous? What are you talking about? Jake's mind was racing. A third party. The situation had just become more complicated. The presence of this new figure suggested that Greg's secrets were even more deeply buried than Jake had realized. And whatever was hidden in this house, it wasn't just about money. It was something darker, something that had drawn multiple factions into its orbit. The tension in the room was palpable. The young man looked as if he was on the verge of either running or making a reckless move. The leader, meanwhile, was clearly growing impatient. You have two options, the leader said, his voice low and menacing. You can leave now and pretend you never heard about this, or you can stick around and find out just how dangerous Greg Harper's secrets are. Your choice. For a moment, no one moved. The room was thick with anticipation, the silence heavy. Then, without warning, the young man made his decision. He bolted, turning on his heel and sprinting back down the stairs. Jake could hear the front door slam as he disappeared into the night. The leader didn't flinch. He turned back to his partner, his expression hard. Let's finish this. We've wasted enough time. A second man resumed his search, his frustration growing with each passing moment. But as they moved toward the far side of the room, Jake saw his chance. The men were distracted, focused on the walls and furniture. Slowly, carefully, Jake pushed the wardrobe door open just enough to slip out. His heart pounded in his ears as he crept across the room, staying low to the ground. The hallway was only a few feet away. He made it halfway to the door when a floorboard creaked under his weight. Both men froze, their heads snapping in his direction. Jake's stomach dropped as their eyes locked onto him. For a split second, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. Stop him, the leader shouted, lunging toward Jake. Without thinking, Jake turned and bolted down the hallway, his feet pounding against the floor as he raced for the stairs. The men were right behind him, their shouts echoing through the narrow space. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps as he threw himself down the staircase, skipping steps in his desperate bid for escape. The front door was only a few feet away. He could make it. He had to. But as he reached for the doorknob, a heavy hand grabbed his shoulder, yanking him backward. Jake stumbled, barely managing to keep his balance as he spun around to face his pursuers. The leader stood before him, his expression cold and furious. You're not going anywhere, he growled. Jake's mind raced. He had no choice. He had to fight. Jake barely had time to process the gravity of the situation before he was yanked backward, his back slamming into the hardwood of the front door. The breath rushed out of him in a gasp, and for a split second, the world blurred, everything moving in slow motion as he faced the leader, a man whose cold, calculating eyes were locked onto his with deadly intent. Jake wasn't a fighter. His life had always been about running from his past, from danger, from people like the men now standing between him and freedom. But he knew, instinctively, that running wasn't an option anymore. These men were here for a reason, and whatever Greg Harper had left behind wasn't just a forgotten inheritance. It was something worth killing for. And they thought Jake had the key. Where do you think you're going? The leader growled, his grip tightening on Jake's shoulder, pulling him away from the door and shoving him toward the center of the room. Jake stumbled but caught himself, his eyes darting around for any possible means of escape. The second man, burly and tattooed, blocked the path to the stairs, his arms crossed in front of him. Jake was cornered. There was no way out now. I don't know anything, Jake gasped, his voice hoarse as he held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. His mind raced, trying to think of something, anything, that could get him out of this alive. I don't know what Greg left here. I don't even know why he left me this house. The leader chuckled darkly, shaking his head as if amused by Jake's desperation. You expect us to believe that? You think Harper just left you his entire estate out of the kindness of his heart? He took a step closer, his voice low and menacing. He left you this place for a reason. You were close to him. You know what he was involved in, and you know what we're after. Jake shook his head frantically. I don't. I swear, I haven't seen Greg in over 20 years. Whatever he was involved in after I left, I had nothing to do with it. The leader's eyes narrowed, and he glanced at the second man, who nodded silently. Without warning, the leader lashed out, slamming his fist into Jake's stomach. The blow knocked the wind out of him, sending him to his knees, gasping for air. Pain shot through his body as he doubled over, clutching his midsection. Liar, the leader spat, his voice cold and emotionless. You're not going to leave this house until you tell us where it is. Jake's mind was spinning. Where what is? He had no idea what they were talking about. He had come to this house expecting to find answers, maybe even some closure about his past with Greg. But instead, he had walked into a deadly game, and he didn't even know the rules. Through the haze of pain, Jake's hand brushed against the inside of his jacket, where Greg's journal was tucked away. He froze for a moment, then a thought struck him like a bolt of lightning. The journal. Greg had warned him in those final entries, warned him to trust no one, to be careful. Whatever these men were looking for, the answer had to be in the journal. But he couldn't let them know he had it. Not yet. The leader crouched down in front of Jake, grabbing him by the collar of his shirt and yanking him up to eye level. His breath was hot and sour on Jake's face, his expression a mixture of frustration and fury. Where is it? I don't know, Jake rasped, stalling for time. What are you even looking for? What did Greg leave behind? The leader's lip curled in disgust. You don't get to ask the questions here, but since you're so clueless, let me enlighten you. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Greg Harper was involved in something big. Bigger than you or this little town could ever imagine. He had a stash, information, money, assets, something he was hiding from everyone, including his enemies. And now, we want it. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. Information. What kind of information could Greg have been hiding? And why had he left it here, in this crumbling old house? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but Jake still didn't have the full picture. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from outside. The front window shattered as something, or someone, came barreling through it, sending shards of glass flying across the room. Jake instinctively ducked, covering his head as the intruders spun around, startled. Before anyone could react, a figure emerged from the chaos, a woman, dressed in dark clothing, her face obscured by a hood and scarf. She moved with lightning speed, her body a blur of motion, as she attacked the leader with a series of swift, precise strikes. The leader stumbled backward, caught off guard by the sudden assault, while the second man lunged toward her, trying to grab her. But the woman was faster. She ducked under his arm, delivering a quick, brutal kick to his knee that sent him crashing to the floor with a howl of pain. In the span of a few seconds, she had disarmed both men, leaving them dazed and confused as she turned toward Jake. For a moment, Jake just stared at her, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Who was she? And why had she come to his rescue? Get up, she ordered, her voice low and urgent. We don't have much time. Jake hesitated, still in shock, but the woman didn't wait for him to recover. She grabbed him by the arm, pulling him to his feet and dragging him toward the back of the house. The two men groaned on the floor, struggling to get back up, but they were too slow. The woman was already moving, and Jake had no choice but to follow her. They burst through the back door and into the overgrown backyard. The night air was cool against Jake's skin, but his heart was still racing, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting the men to come after them, but they were still inside, recovering from the woman's attack. Who are you?" Jake panted, stumbling after her as they made their way toward the tree line at the edge of the property. "Not now," the woman snapped, glancing back at him with sharp, focused eyes. "We need to get out of here before they regroup. They won't stay down for long." Jake's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and questions, but he forced himself to stay silent, trusting her instincts. They reached the trees, and the woman led him through the dense underbrush, moving quickly and silently as if she had done this 100 times before. Jake struggled to keep up, his muscles aching from the fight and the sprint, but he didn't dare slow down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing. The woman stopped, glancing around to make sure they weren't being followed. Satisfied that they were safe for the moment, she turned to Jake, pulling back her hood to reveal a face that was both familiar and foreign at the same time. Jake's eyes widened in shock. Emily. The woman, Emily, the young housekeeper who had worked for one of the wealthiest families in Riverbend, nodded grimly. Her face was streaked with dirt and sweat, but her eyes were hard, determined. "You know her?" Jake asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Emily looked away, her jaw tight. "Not exactly, but I know enough to understand that she's been watching you. Watching this place, and now you've dragged me into it." Jake blinked, trying to make sense of her words. Watching me. None of this was making any sense. Emily was just a housekeeper, a quiet, unassuming young woman who had grown up in Riverbend. How could she be involved in something like this? "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice rising in frustration. "Who are those men? What are they looking for?" Emily crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "They're looking for Greg Harper's secret. And you, Jake, are the key to finding it." Jake shook his head, confused. "Me? Why me? I don't know anything about Greg's secret. I haven't seen him in over 20 years. Emily sighed, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "You might not know it, but Greg left you the key to everything. His journal, the house, everything. And now everyone who's been after him is after you." Jake's stomach churned. The weight of her words sank in, and he realized with a sickening certainty that she was right. Greg had left him more than just a house. He had left him a dangerous legacy, a legacy that was now putting both of their lives in danger. Emily glanced around nervously, her eyes scanning the darkness. "We can't stay here. They'll find us eventually. We need to move. Now." Jake opened his mouth to protest, but before he could say anything, Emily grabbed his arm and pulled him forward, leading him deeper into the woods. The woods were thick and dark, the tall trees looming overhead like silent sentinels as Emily and Jake made their way through the underbrush. The air was cold, biting at Jake's skin, but the adrenaline coursing through his veins kept him moving. His mind was still reeling from everything that had just happened. 1 minute he was trying to uncover the mysteries of Greg Harper's estate, and the next he was on the run from armed men, led by none other than a woman he barely knew. Emily moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been trained for this sort of situation. She navigated the forest like it was second nature, her movements quick and sure, while Jake struggled to keep up, his breath coming in short gasps. His body ached from the earlier confrontation, his lungs burning with the effort of keeping pace, but there was no time to stop. Not yet. After what felt like hours, Emily finally slowed her pace, leading them to a small clearing nestled deep within the forest. The moonlight broke through the canopy overhead, casting an eerie glow on the ground below. Emily knelt down, listening for any sounds of pursuit. Satisfied that they hadn't been followed, she motioned for Jake to sit. "You need to tell me what's going on," Jake said, his voice tight with frustration. "You saved my life back there, but I have no idea why. And now you're saying I'm the key to finding Greg's secret. What does that even mean? Emily remained silent for a moment, her expression hard and thoughtful. She glanced around, as if still expecting the men from the house to appear out of the shadows. Finally, she let out a long breath and looked at Jake, her face a mask of determination. "It's complicated," she began, her voice low. "More complicated than you know. But you're right. You deserve answers." Jake leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "I've spent the last few days trying to figure out what Greg left behind. All I know is that I inherited the house, and these men showed up claiming Greg was hiding something. What was Greg involved in? What's so valuable that people are willing to kill for it?" Emily glanced away, her jaw tight. Greg wasn't just involved in small-time business deals. He was connected to something much bigger. A few years after you left, he got mixed up with a group of people, dangerous people. They're involved in smuggling, fraud, and arms dealing. Greg wasn't an innocent bystander. He was right in the middle of it. Jake felt a pit form in his stomach. He had suspected that Greg had gotten into trouble after their falling out, but he hadn't imagined anything on this scale. Emily continued, her voice growing more intense. "He wasn't just hiding from the law, Jake. He was hiding from them, the people he worked with. He double-crossed them, stole something important, and disappeared. They'd been looking for him ever since." Jake's mind raced. What did he steal? Emily's eyes darkened. Information. Documents, ledgers, proof of their illegal activities. But it wasn't just the information that was valuable. It was what he planned to do with it. Greg was going to use it as leverage to cut a deal, to escape with a new identity. But before he could, he vanished. Jake's pulse quickened as he remembered the journal in his jacket. The journal, he muttered under his breath. Greg left a journal behind. Is that what they're after? Emily nodded. Part of it, yes. The journal is a map, a guide to where Greg hid the documents. He didn't trust anyone with them, not even me. He left clues, hints scattered throughout his writings, hoping that if anything happened to him, someone could piece it together. But it's dangerous information, Jake. It's the kind of thing that people will kill for. And now that Greg is gone, they think you're the one who knows where it is. Jake's head spun. He had been thrust into the middle of something far bigger than he ever could have imagined. Greg's death wasn't just the tragic end of an old friend. It was the spark that had reignited a dangerous game of cat and mouse, with Jake caught right in the middle. "And you," Jake said, turning his gaze to Emily. "What's your connection to all of this? You were just the housekeeper. How do you know so much about Greg's dealings?" Emily's face hardened, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I wasn't just the housekeeper. Greg trusted me with more than just cleaning his home. I was his confidant, his lookout. I helped him cover his tracks when he went underground, and I kept an eye on his enemies. When he disappeared, I thought I was out of it for good, but then I found out he'd left you the house. I had to make sure you weren't walking into a death trap." Jake stared at her, trying to reconcile the image of the quiet, unassuming housekeeper with the woman who had just saved his life. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why let me get involved at all?" Emily's eyes softened, a hint of regret crossing her face. "I didn't want to pull you into this. I thought if you didn't know anything, they might leave you alone. But when those men showed up tonight, I knew it was too late. They won't stop until they have what they want." Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to process everything. The weight of it all felt like too much to bear. "So what do we do now?" he asked, his voice quiet. Emily stood, her expression resolute. "We have to find the documents before they do. It's the only way to protect ourselves and the town. If that information falls into the wrong hands, they'll destroy anyone connected to Greg." Jake's heart sank. Riverbend was a small, tight-knit community. If these men were willing to go to such lengths to recover the stolen documents, there was no telling what they would do to anyone who got in their way. And Jake knew all too well that they wouldn't hesitate to use violence. As if reading his thoughts, Emily stepped closer. "We're not just talking about protecting you, Jake. We're talking about the safety of everyone in Riverbend. These men are ruthless. If they think anyone in town knows where the documents are, they won't hesitate to come after them." The enormity of the situation crashed down on Jake like a tidal wave. His peaceful life in Riverbend had been an illusion, an escape from a past that had finally caught up with him. And now, the safety of the town, of the people he had grown to care about, was in jeopardy because of secrets buried long ago. "Okay," Jake said, taking a deep breath. "Okay, we find the documents. But how?" "Greg's journal. It's cryptic. I've looked through it, and I couldn't make sense of half of it." Emily's lips tightened into a thin line. "I can help with that. I've been studying his journals for years. I know how he thinks. Together, we can figure out where he hid the documents." Jake nodded, though doubt still gnawed at the edges of his mind. This felt like an impossible task, decoding the twisted mind of Greg Harper while being hunted by men willing to kill for whatever secrets he had stolen. But there was no turning back now. As dawn began to break, casting a pale light over the forest, Jake and Emily returned to the house. They knew the men who had attacked them would be back, and they didn't have much time. The house, despite its decaying exterior, held the key to everything. Somewhere within its walls was the final clue to unlocking Greg's hidden cache of information. Inside, the wreckage of the previous night's confrontation was still evident. Broken glass littered the floor, and the front door hung crookedly on its hinges. But the house was quiet now, empty save for the two of them. Emily wasted no time. She led Jake back upstairs to Greg's study, where the journal lay open on the desk, just as Jake had left it. She flipped through the pages, scanning the cryptic notes and fragmented thoughts Greg had scribbled in his final days. "There," she said, stopping at a particular entry. "This is what we're looking for." Jake leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the faded ink. The entry was written in Greg's hurried scrawl, barely legible, but one phrase stood out. "The heart of the house holds the truth. Trust in the past to unlock the future." "What does that mean?" Jake asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the center of the room, her eyes scanning the walls and floor as if searching for something. After a moment, she stood and walked toward the fireplace, running her fingers along the mantel. "The heart of the house," she murmured to herself. "It's not a metaphor. It's literal." Jake watched as she knelt down in front of the fireplace, carefully inspecting the bricks. For a moment, he wasn't sure what she was looking for, but then, with a soft click, one of the bricks shifted. Emily pulled it free, revealing a small compartment hidden within the wall. Inside was a stack of papers, yellowed with age but intact. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she pulled them out, her eyes widening in shock. "This is it," she whispered. "Greg's insurance policy." Jake stepped forward, his heart pounding. "What's in them?" Emily flipped through Emily's fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through the yellowed pages, her eyes scanning each one with a mix of disbelief and awe. Jake, standing beside her, could hardly breathe as he watched her. This was the moment they had been racing toward. The moment when Greg Harper's dark secrets would finally be brought to light. The moment when they would understand exactly what Greg had stolen and why men were willing to kill to get it back. The papers in Emily's hands were brittle, the ink faded but still legible. The documents appeared to be a mixture of financial records, personal letters, and ledgers, evidence of transactions that linked Greg Harper to some of the most powerful and dangerous criminal organizations in the world. The names on the papers were enough to make Jake's stomach churn. Names he recognized from news reports, whispered rumors, and his own buried memories of a time when he and Greg had dabbled in dangerous waters. "What is all this?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking any louder would break the fragile atmosphere in the room. Emily's eyes darted back and forth across the pages, her brow furrowing in concentration. "It's everything," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Greg kept records of everything. Every deal, every client, every bribe. It's all here. Names, dates, amounts. This could bring down half the city's underworld. Jake's head swam. He had known Greg was involved in illegal activities, but he hadn't realized the scope. These weren't just small-time deals or petty crimes. This was organized, high-level corruption that stretched far beyond anything Jake had ever imagined. The weight of it hit him all at once. He wasn't just in over his head. He was drowning in a sea of secrets that could destroy lives, ruin reputations, and topple powerful figures. Why didn't he destroy this? Jake asked, his voice hoarse. Emily looked up from the papers, her eyes hard. Because Greg wasn't just trying to survive. He was playing both sides. He knew that if he ever got caught, this would be his bargaining chip. This was his insurance policy, the one thing that would keep him alive. And now, it's yours. Jake took a step back, the enormity of the situation crashing down on him. He had inherited more than just a dilapidated house and a collection of old papers. He had inherited a deadly game, one that Greg had barely escaped, and one that now had Jake squarely in its sights. For a long moment, the room was silent, the only sound the distant chirping of birds outside as the early morning light filtered through the cracked windows. Jake felt as though the walls were closing in on him. The weight of Greg's legacy, of the secrets he had uncovered, pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily's expression hardened with determination. "We go public. We have to take this to the authorities. If we hold on to this, it's only a matter of time before those men, or worse, come for us. But if we get it into the right hands, we might stand a chance." Jake shook his head. "And what happens then? These people, they're not just going to let this go. Even if we hand it over, they'll come after us. They'll come after the town." Emily's eyes softened slightly, and for the first time since Jake had met her, he saw a flicker of vulnerability. "I know," she admitted. "But if we do nothing, more people will die." Greg tried to run, and look where it got him. "We can't run. We have to fight back." Jake's mind raced. The town, the people of Riverbend, the place he had called home for the last 15 years, were now in danger because of his connection to Greg. If the documents were as explosive as they seemed, the criminals hunting them wouldn't hesitate to burn the entire town down to get what they wanted. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, but the weight of responsibility felt unbearable. He had never asked for this. All he had wanted was a quiet life, a chance to leave his troubled past behind and find some semblance of peace. But now that peace was shattered, and there was no going back. "We need to do this carefully," Jake finally said, his voice stronger now. "We can't just go to the local police. They might be compromised. We need someone we can trust, someone who has the resources to protect us and the town." Emily nodded, her face grim. "I know a guy in the FBI. He owes me a favor. If we can get these documents to him, he'll know what to do." Jake felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly tempered by the knowledge of what was coming. "And the men who are after us." Emily's expression darkened. "They won't stop. They'll come for us, even after the documents are gone. But at least this way, we'll have some leverage." For the next few hours, Jake and Emily worked quickly, sorting through the documents, scanning what they could, and organizing the most important pieces of evidence. Emily made a few cryptic phone calls, speaking in hushed tones to contacts who could help them. By midday, they had a plan in place, a risky, dangerous plan, but the only one that offered any hope of survival. They would meet Emily's contact that night in a secluded location on the outskirts of town to hand over the documents. In exchange, they would receive federal protection, at least. That was the hope. But Jake knew that nothing was guaranteed. The men who were after them were ruthless, and if they caught wind of what Jake and Emily were planning, there would be no escape. As the afternoon wore on, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, Every rustle of the trees outside made his heart race with fear. He knew it was only a matter of time before the men returned to the house. They had escaped once, but their luck wouldn't hold forever. As dusk fell, Jake and Emily packed the documents into a worn duffel bag and made their way through the woods to the meeting point. The air was thick with tension, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. The sky above was darkening, the last traces of sunlight fading into a deep, inky blue. They arrived at the rendezvous point, a remote clearing near the edge of a quarry. The location was isolated, far from prying eyes, but that didn't ease Jake's nerves. His entire body was tense, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. "Are you sure your contact will show?" Jake asked, his voice tight with anxiety. Emily nodded, though her eyes betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "He'll show. He knows what's at stake." Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. The clearing was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the wind through the trees. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he tightened his grip on the duffel bag. Finally, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man in a dark suit, his face obscured by the low light. He approached cautiously, his hands raised to show he wasn't a threat. "Emily," the man said, his voice calm but laced with urgency. "You aren't kidding about the heat on this one. We need to move fast." Emily nodded, stepping forward to greet him. "We have the documents. All of it. But we need protection. Witness protection. For both of us. And for the town. These people won't stop." The man's eyes flicked to Jake, sizing him up before he nodded. "You'll get it. But we need to move now. There's chatter that they're already on their way." Jake's blood ran cold. "They know we're here." The man shook his head. "Not yet, but it won't take them long to figure it out." Suddenly, the sound of tires screeching echoed through the trees. Jake's heart jumped into his throat as headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness like knives. The men had found them. "Go," the agent shouted, drawing a gun from his holster. "I'll cover you. Get to the safe house. There's a team waiting for you there." Emily grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him toward the edge of the clearing as the cars sped closer. The sound of gunfire erupted behind them as the agent fired off shots, covering their escape. Jake's legs burned with the effort of running, but adrenaline pushed him forward, his heart pounding in his ears. They burst through the trees, sprinting toward a black SUV parked at the edge of the quarry. A group of armed federal agents waited for them, motioning for them to get inside. Jake barely had time to catch his breath as they piled into the vehicle, the doors slamming shut behind them. As the SUV sped away, Jake glanced out the window, watching as the clearing disappeared behind them. His mind was spinning, his body still trembling from the adrenaline. But one thought stood out above the rest. They had survived. For now. But as the dark road stretched ahead, Jake knew that the journey was far from over. Greg Harper's legacy had changed everything. The secrets buried in that old house had unleashed a storm that would ripple through the town, through the lives of everyone Jake had ever known.